Welcome back to part 2. If you just joined us here, we left off with Marcus walking in on Renata and me just seconds before something happened that neither of us could have taken back. If this is your first time hearing this story, make sure you hit subscribe on RP, Forbidden Romances, so you don't miss where this goes next, because it only gets more intense from here. Now let me pick up exactly where I left you, standing frozen in that hidden room with a paintbrush shaking in my hand, and my heart still hammering from everything that almost happened. The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur of forced normalcy that felt almost unbearable to sit through. Marcus lingered in the doorway for a few more minutes, asking casual questions about the painting, about my week, about nothing in particular, while I answered on autopilot, my mind still spinning from what had almost happened just moments before he walked in. Renata kept her back to him for longer than necessary, pretending to clean a brush that was already clean, and I noticed her hands still weren't entirely steady. Eventually, he wandered off to change out of his work clothes, and the second he was gone, Renata and I looked at each other across that room, neither of us saying a single word. I made some excuse about needing to leave, something about another client waiting on edited photos, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. She nodded quickly, too quickly, walking me to the front door with a stiffness that hadn't existed between us in weeks. Marcus called out a friendly goodbye from somewhere upstairs, completely oblivious to the tension suffocating the hallway below him. I said goodbye to Renata at the door, and for one terrible second, neither of us knew how to look at each other. The easy warmth from an hour earlier, replaced by something awkward and raw. I drove home that evening with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my mind replaying the same few seconds over and over like a broken record. Once I got home, I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time, not bothering to turn on any lights, just sitting with the weight of everything I'd almost done. I told myself firmly that this had to stop, that whatever had been building between us for weeks needed to end before it destroyed something that couldn't be rebuilt. Marcus was my best friend, the person who had shown up for me through every terrible year of my life, and I had nearly kissed his wife, in a room he didn't even know existed. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, tangled up uncomfortably with something else I refused to name, something that felt disturbingly close to disappointment that we'd been interrupted at all. I told myself I didn't feel anything for her, that it had just been a strange, charged moment, born out of too much closeness and too little boundary. I repeated that explanation to myself over and over that night, like if I said it enough times it might actually start feeling true. But even as I lay awake staring at my ceiling, I found myself reaching for my phone to reread her last message from days earlier, something small and unremarkable about a painting technique she wanted to show me. I read it probably 5 or 6 times, searching for something in the words that wasn't actually there, some hidden meaning I desperately wanted to find. It was pathetic, I told myself, and I put the phone down each time, only to pick it back up 20 minutes later. 2 days passed with nothing between us. No texts, no calls, an unfamiliar silence that felt heavier than any conversation could have. I threw myself into work instead, editing photos late into the night, taking on extra jobs I didn't need just to keep my hands and mind occupied with something other than her face. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach dropped with a mixture of hope and dread that embarrassed me the moment I checked it and saw it wasn't her. I told myself this silence was a good thing, that maybe we'd both come to our senses, and quietly agreed to let whatever this was fade back into normal friendship. I almost believed it, until the third night, when my phone finally lit up with her name. My heart lurched the second I saw it, and I sat staring at the notification for a full minute before I found the courage to open it. Her message was longer than usual, clearly written and rewritten several times, the careful phrasing of someone choosing every word with caution. She apologized first, said she was sorry for how awkward things had gotten, sorry if she'd made me uncomfortable or put me in an unfair position with Marcus. I read that part quickly, my chest tightening with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment I didn't want to examine too closely. But then the message continued, and what came next stopped my breath completely. She said she didn't want to lose whatever this was between us, whatever we'd built in that hidden room over the past few weeks, that the thought of things going back to distant politeness felt unbearable to her. She admitted, in words far more honest than I expected, that she had been thinking about me constantly since that afternoon, unable to focus on anything else, replaying that almost moment on a loop she couldn't seem to turn off. My hands were trembling slightly as I read it a second time, then a third, searching for any hint that she might be exaggerating, and finding none. I sat there for a long time after reading it, phone glowing in the darkness of my apartment, trying to figure out how to respond to something that honest, without either lying to her or admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud. Every rational part of me knew the right response was distance, was some gentle, careful message about needing space, about protecting Marcus, about doing the right thing for everyone involved. But my thumbs hovered over the screen, and the words that eventually came out weren't careful or distant at all. I told her I felt the exact same way, that I hadn't stopped thinking about her either. And the second I hit send, I understood there was no pretending anymore that this was simply friendship between two people who happened to understand each other. I put my phone down after that and sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at nothing, fully aware of what I had just admitted and everything it meant going forward. Guilt sat right alongside something warmer and far more dangerous, twin feelings I couldn't seem to separate no matter how hard I tried. I thought about Marcus's face in that doorway, the easy trust in his voice when he greeted me like nothing was wrong, and I hated myself a little for what I was allowing to grow behind his back. But somewhere underneath that guilt, quieter but undeniably present, was a kind of relief I hadn't expected to feel. Relief that she felt it too, that I wasn't losing my mind alone. I fell asleep that night, knowing there was no version of this story where I walked away unchanged, whichever direction it eventually went. Nearly a week passed after that late-night confession before Renata reached out again, this time with a reason that felt almost too convenient to be entirely innocent. Marcus had a work trip coming up, she explained, 3 days away for some conference she barely remembered the name of, and she wondered if I wanted to come finish the painting we'd left unfinished on that awful Thursday. She framed it carefully, casually, like it was nothing more than tying up a loose end between friends. I stared at that message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen, fully aware that nothing about this invitation was as simple as she made it sound. I told myself I should say no, that saying yes was reckless in a way I couldn't take back once I'd done it. Marcus trusted me completely, had trusted me for years, and going to his empty house to be alone with his wife felt like crossing a line that no painting excuse could disguise. I actually started typing out a polite decline, some excuse about work deadlines, my thumb pausing right over the send button for what felt like an eternity. I sat there in my kitchen, phone in hand, arguing with myself in a way that felt almost comical in its desperation, like some part of me already knew which side of the argument was going to win. In the end, I deleted the excuse and typed something else entirely, agreeing to come by that Friday evening once Marcus had already left for his flight. The second I hit send, my stomach dropped with a mixture of anticipation and dread so tangled together I couldn't separate one from the other. I spent the rest of that week in a strange state of distraction, unable to focus properly on client work, catching myself staring at nothing for long stretches, while my mind wandered somewhere it had no business going. Every time I thought about backing out, some quieter, more honest part of me refused to let me type the words. Friday arrived faster than I was prepared for, the afternoon light already softening toward evening by the time I pulled up outside her house. I sat in my car for a full minute before going inside, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady the nervous energy buzzing beneath my skin. This is just about the painting, I told myself firmly. Just two friends finishing something they'd started together. Nothing more complicated needed to happen tonight. I almost believed it walking up to her front door. Almost believed it right up until she opened it, and I saw the way she was looking at me. She'd clearly put some thought into that evening, her hair down instead of pulled back, wearing something simple but clearly chosen with care, rather than thrown on without thought. Neither of us said much as she led me inside, the air between us charged with everything we'd both admitted through text, but hadn't yet said out loud in person. The house felt different with Marcus gone. Quieter in a way that made every small sound feel amplified. Every glance between us feel weighted, with a significance neither of us could ignore. We made our way toward her studio the way we always did, but this time our shoulders brushed in the narrow hallway, and neither of us pulled away from the contact. We didn't paint much that evening, both of us too aware of the other's presence to focus properly on anything requiring real concentration. She poured 2 glasses of wine not long after I arrived, and we ended up sitting on the floor of her studio instead of standing at our easels, talking about nothing important in a way that somehow felt like the most important conversation either of us had ever had. Her knee occasionally brushed against mine as she shifted position, and each time it happened, awareness sparked through me sharp enough that I lost track of whatever sentence I'd been in the middle of saying. She noticed too. I could tell by the way her voice would trail off sometimes mid-thought, her eyes catching mine before darting away again. Outside, the evening light had shifted from gold to something dimmer, shadows stretching longer across the studio floor as we talked. She mentioned almost offhandedly that Marcus's flight had already landed, that he'd texted saying the conference hotel was nice, completely unaware of where his absence had led the two of us. Something about hearing his name out loud in that moment sent a small, uncomfortable jolt of guilt through me, quickly overtaken by the warmth radiating from wherever her hand rested near mine on the floor. I noticed she'd stopped drinking her wine somewhere along the way, more focused on watching me than on anything else in the room. At some point, she asked quietly if I regretted answering her text the way I had, if I'd thought about taking it back since then. I told her honestly that I hadn't, that if anything I'd thought about very little else all week, my voice coming out steadier than I actually felt saying it out loud. She smiled at that, something soft and relieved crossing her face, and she shifted slightly closer to me on the floor, close enough that I could feel warmth radiating from her skin again, the same way I had weeks earlier in this very room. Neither of us moved away this time, both of us simply sitting there, letting the closeness exist without rushing toward whatever it might become. Outside, clouds had been gathering steadily throughout the evening, and as we sat there together, the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky in the distance. Renata glanced toward the window, mentioning something about a storm supposedly rolling through overnight, her voice distracted, more focused on me than on the weather. I felt a strange flutter of anticipation at the sound, some part of me already sensing that this night wasn't going to end the way either of us had originally planned when I agreed to come over. Neither of us said anything about it directly, but something unspoken passed between us as the thunder rolled closer, something that felt inevitable in a way neither of us seemed inclined to stop. I remember thinking, as the first drops of rain began tapping softly against the studio window, that I should probably leave before the storm got worse, before the roads became difficult to navigate safely home. But some part of me, quieter and more honest than the version of myself that made careful, responsible decisions, already knew I wasn't going anywhere that night. Renata seemed to know it too, her eyes finding mine across the small space between us, something unspoken but entirely clear, passing silently in the charged air of that room. Whatever this storm was bringing with it, I had a feeling neither of us was prepared to fight against it any longer. The storm outside grew stronger with each passing minute, rain hammering hard against the windows now, thunder rolling closer with a violence that made the entire house seem to shudder slightly around us. Renata stood and moved to check the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal a sky completely lost to darkness and rain, the kind of storm that made driving anywhere feel genuinely dangerous. She turned back to me with an expression that was trying hard to look apologetic, though something else entirely lived underneath it. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," she said quietly, and neither of us pretended that thought filled her with any real regret. I told her that was fine, that I didn't mind waiting it out, my voice coming out steadier than the storm building inside my own chest. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a fresh bottle of wine and 2 glasses, settling back down beside me on the studio floor instead of retreating to somewhere more appropriately distant. We talked for a while about nothing important, filling the space with easy conversation that kept circling back, again and again, to silences neither of us seemed eager to break. Every refill of wine brought us slightly closer together, though I couldn't have told you exactly when the physical distance between us had started disappearing. At some point, she brought up Marcus, unprompted, her voice growing quieter and more serious than it had been all evening. She admitted carefully that things between them had been distant for longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge out loud, that comfort had long since replaced whatever passion originally brought them together. I asked gently if she'd ever told him that, and she shook her head slowly, staring down into her wine glass like the answer embarrassed her somehow. "It's easier to just keep going," she admitted quietly. "Easier than admitting something might actually be broken beyond simple repair." I felt a strange mixture of guilt and tenderness listening to her. Guilt because some selfish part of me was grateful for the distance in her marriage. Tenderness because nobody deserved to feel unseen inside their own life. I told her, as gently as I could, that she deserved more than easier, that comfort wasn't the same thing as being truly happy. She looked up at me then, eyes glassy in the dim light of the studio, and something passed across her face that looked almost like fear, like she was standing at the edge of admitting something she couldn't take back. "I'm scared of what I actually want," she whispered, and the honesty in her voice hit me somewhere deep and unguarded. I told her I understood exactly that feeling, that I'd spent weeks trying to convince myself I didn't want what I very clearly wanted. For a moment, neither of us said anything else, just sitting there in charged silence, rain drumming steadily against the windows around us. Then, almost as if some invisible thread finally snapped, she set her wineglass down and reached for my hand, her fingers lacing slowly through mine like she needed to know it was actually real. "I should stop this," I heard myself say quietly, though I made no move whatsoever to pull my hand away from hers. "I know," she whispered back, and neither of us stopped anything at all. We ended up in front of the fireplace sometime later, the storm still raging steadily outside, orange firelight flickering warm and low across the room. She sat close beside me, her head eventually finding its way to my shoulder, and I could feel her breathing slow and deepen against me, in a way that felt like trust settling into place. Neither of us spoke for a long while, simply existing there together in the quiet, warm glow, listening to rain and distant thunder outside. I remember thinking, in that suspended moment, that I had never felt so completely present with another person in my entire life. She lifted her head eventually, turning to look at me with an expression that held none of the fear from earlier, only something steady and certain that hadn't been there before. "I'm not scared anymore," she said softly, and before I could respond, she leaned in and closed the distance between us completely. Her lips met mine gently at first, testing, careful, like she needed to make absolutely sure this was real, before allowing herself to fully feel it. I responded without hesitation, months of buried tension finally released in a single aching kiss. The kiss deepened slowly, both of us pouring weeks of restraint into something we'd been denying ourselves since that very first night at the party. Her hand came up to cup my face gently, the same way I'd touched her weeks earlier, and I felt something in my chest crack wide open, all my careful walls collapsing at once. I pulled her closer, and she came willingly, the firelight casting warm shadows across her skin as she settled into my arms like she belonged there completely. Neither of us said anything else that mattered beyond that moment. The storm outside, and every consequence waiting beyond that room, fading into something distant and unimportant. What happened between us, after that kiss, I'll leave mostly to your imagination, except to say that the rest of that stormy night was the most honest either of us had been in years. We fell asleep eventually tangled together in front of the dying fire, her head resting against my chest, my arms wrapped protectively around her, like I could somehow shield her from every consequence waiting on the other side of morning. I remember the last thought drifting through my mind before sleep finally took me, a quiet certainty that nothing about my life would ever look the same again after that night. I had no idea yet just how right I was. I woke up before she did. Gray morning light filtering weakly through the studio windows. The storm outside having finally quieted into a soft, steady drizzle. For a moment, still half asleep, everything felt peaceful. Her warmth pressed against my side, the dying embers still glowing faintly in the fireplace. Then memory came flooding back all at once, and my stomach dropped with a sharp, sudden weight that peace couldn't survive. I lay there perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, letting the full reality of the night before settle heavy across my chest. Renata stirred beside me a few minutes later, blinking slowly awake, and I watched her face carefully, bracing myself for regret, for panic, for anything that might mirror the guilt already twisting through my own stomach. Instead, she smiled, soft and unguarded, reaching up to brush her fingers against my cheek with a tenderness that caught me completely off guard. "Good morning," she said quietly, like waking up tangled together on her studio floor was the most natural thing in the world. Something in her eyes looked settled, certain, entirely different from the fear I'd seen there just hours earlier. I sat up slowly, running a hand through my hair, unable to match the calm radiating so effortlessly from her. She noticed immediately, propping herself up on one elbow, studying my face with a concern that only made the guilt in my chest twist tighter. I told her, honestly, that I didn't know how to feel, that everything about last night had felt right in the moment, but impossibly complicated in the gray light of morning. She nodded slowly, no hurt in her expression, just quiet understanding, and reached for my hand again, like she needed to keep some physical thread of connection between us while I worked through it. "I'm not scared like I was last night," she said gently, "and I don't feel guilty either. Not the way you're clearly feeling right now." I asked her how that was possible, how she could wake up after everything and feel nothing but peace, when I could barely breathe past the weight sitting on my chest. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully, before explaining that she'd been unhappy for so long, she'd stopped even noticing it, until the night she watched me photograph her, and remembered what it felt like to be truly seen. "Last night wasn't a mistake," she said firmly. "It was the first honest thing I've done in years." I wanted so badly to feel that same certainty, but Marcus's face kept surfacing behind my eyes every time I tried. He was my best friend, the person who trusted me completely, who had no idea that the woman he married had spent the night in my arms instead of on a lonely flight home from a work conference. I told Renata this, my voice thick with everything I was struggling to hold together, and she listened without interrupting, letting me say every difficult thing I needed to get out. "Guilt isn't the same thing as being wrong," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Sometimes guilt just means you care about people you're inevitably going to hurt either way." I asked her quietly what she planned to do now, whether anything had actually changed for her beyond one storm-soaked night neither of us could take back. She sat up fully then, meeting my eyes directly, something resolved settling across her features that hadn't been there the evening before. "I'm going to talk to him," she said simply. "Not today, not this instant, but soon, because staying in something hollow isn't fair to either of us anymore." I felt something loosen slightly in my chest hearing that, though the guilt didn't disappear entirely, just shifted into something more complicated. Hope tangled uncomfortably alongside shame. We sat together for a long while after that, not saying much, just existing quietly in the soft gray light, while the last of the storm cleared outside. She rested her head against my shoulder again, and this time I let myself lean into it fully, rather than holding myself carefully apart the way I had all night. I still didn't know exactly what came next, whether this was the beginning of something real, or the start of losing my best friend forever. But I knew, sitting there with her fingers laced through mine, that I couldn't go back to pretending I didn't feel what I felt, no matter how much easier that pretending might have made everything. Eventually I had to leave. The reality of the outside world pressing back in, no matter how badly either of us wanted to stay suspended in that quiet morning. She walked me to the door, and we stood there for a long moment, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. She kissed me softly before I left. Nothing rushed or desperate like the night before, just tender and certain, a promise rather than a question. I drove home that morning with the guilt still sitting heavy in my chest, but underneath it, quiet and undeniable, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The days that followed felt strange, suspended somewhere between normal life and the enormous shift that had happened between us. I threw myself into work again, the same way I had after our almost kiss weeks earlier, except this time there was no pretending underneath it, no convincing myself that nothing had changed. Every time my phone buzzed with her name, warmth spread through my chest instead of the anxious dread I'd felt before, and that difference alone told me everything I needed to know about how far past turning back I already was. I didn't know yet what conversation she was having with Marcus, or when or how it would end, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the space between guilt and wanting much longer. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Renata texted again, this time asking me to come by her house instead of meeting somewhere neutral like usual. She said she wanted to look over the final photographs from our session together, now that the prints were framed and hung, now that the house belonged entirely to her and nobody else. Something about the phrase entirely to her sent a small jolt of hope straight through my chest, though I forced myself not to read too far into 2 words in a text message. I told her I'd come by that Saturday morning and spent the days leading up to it in a strange, suspended state of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Her house looked different when I arrived, though I couldn't immediately place why. Something subtle shifted in the atmosphere the moment she opened the door. She looked lighter somehow, her smile reaching her eyes in a way that felt effortless instead of carefully maintained. She led me into the kitchen, already pouring 2 cups of coffee, moving through the space with an ease that made the whole house feel more like a home than it had on any of my previous visits. I sat down at her kitchen island, watching her move, trying to figure out what exactly had changed since I'd last seen her. She set my coffee down in front of me, and finally met my eyes directly, something steady and certain in her expression. I have news, she said, wrapping both hands around her own mug like she needed something to hold on to while she said it. Marcus and I talked, really talked, for the first time in longer than either of us could probably remember, and it's over. My heart stopped for half a second, waiting for the rest of the sentence, waiting to hear whether the ending in her voice meant devastation or relief. She explained it slowly, carefully, that the conversation hadn't been angry or dramatic the way I'd braced myself for, just honest in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be in years. He admitted he'd felt the distance too, she said, that he'd buried himself in work, partly because home had started feeling like something to manage rather than something to return to. There was no shouting, no blame thrown across the kitchen table, just 2 people finally admitting that whatever they'd built together had quietly stopped being a marriage a long time before that morning. She said it without cruelty toward him, and something about that gentleness made me respect her even more than I already did. I asked, carefully, if he knew anything about what had happened between us, my stomach tightening as I waited for her answer. She shook her head slowly, explaining that she hadn't told him, that this decision was about the 2 of them, and what had been missing between them long before I ever entered the picture. I felt guilt and relief tangled together again, the same complicated knot I'd been carrying for weeks, though something had shifted in how heavy it felt sitting in my chest. She reached across the counter and took my hand, saying quietly that she needed him to understand it was about their marriage first, not about anyone else at all. We sat there for a while, letting that news settle between us, coffee slowly going lukewarm in our cups while the morning light shifted across her kitchen. Eventually she stood, taking my hand and pulling me gently toward the hallway, saying there was something else she wanted to show me before we looked at the photographs. I followed her back toward that familiar door at the end of the hall, my heart picking up slightly the way it always did whenever we headed toward her studio. She pushed the door open, and there, propped on an easel in the center of the room, sat a canvas I hadn't seen before. I stepped closer, and my breath caught the moment I understood what I was looking at. It was a close-up in profile, painted with a tenderness that felt almost unbearable to witness. 2 mouths captured in the instant just before they touched. A thumb rested gently against the lower lip of one mouth, pulling it down ever so slightly. The gesture somehow more intimate than any kiss could have been on canvas. The brushwork was soft, deliberate, every stroke clearly agonized over, colors blending warm and golden like firelight caught mid-flicker. She'd titled it in small, careful letters near the bottom corner, "The Unfinished Kiss." I turned to look at her, unable to find words for a long moment, and she watched me with an expression somewhere between nervous and hopeful. "I painted it the week after that storm," she admitted quietly, "because I couldn't stop thinking about that moment in this very room, the one Marcus interrupted before we ever got to finish it." Her voice softened further as she continued, saying that no matter what happened afterward, that particular moment had never actually left her, had stayed lodged somewhere she couldn't paint her way out of. I reached out and touched the edge of the canvas gently, overwhelmed by how completely she'd captured something I'd been carrying too, unspoken, since that very afternoon. She stepped closer to me then, close enough that I could feel the same warmth I remembered from that unfinished moment, close enough that the space between us felt charged all over again. "We're not interrupted this time," she said softly, her eyes searching mine for permission I was already giving her without needing to speak it aloud. I reached up and brushed my thumb gently against her lower lip, the same way she'd painted it, the same way I'd touched her weeks earlier before everything got interrupted. This time, nothing stopped us, and when our lips finally met, it felt like closing a circle that had been left open far too long. Months passed after that morning in her studio, each one settling us further into something that finally felt solid instead of stolen. We didn't rush announcing anything to the world, choosing instead to let what we had grow quietly, privately, on our own terms, rather than anyone else's timeline. Marcus, to his credit, had taken the divorce with far more grace than either of us expected, focusing himself entirely into work and eventually into dating again himself. He never learned the full truth about the timeline of everything, and Renata and I made peace with letting that particular detail stay buried, protecting a friendship that had already survived enough. By the time autumn rolled around, Renata and I were no longer hiding anything, no longer glancing over our shoulders or lowering our voices when we talked about each other to mutual friends. We'd moved in together that September, combining her house with all my scattered camera equipment. My apartment finally emptied of a life that had never quite fit me the way this one did. Her hidden studio wasn't hidden anymore either, the door propped permanently open now, sunlight pouring freely into a room that used to hold so much quiet loneliness. I'd started keeping some of my own equipment in there too, our 2 separate crafts slowly merging into something shared. We turned part of the garage into a proper studio space eventually, big enough for both my photography setup and her canvases, natural light flooding through windows we'd installed together on a weekend that involved more laughing than actual productive work. It became our favorite place in the entire house, the space where we spent most weekend afternoons, her painting while I edited photos nearby, both of us existing comfortably in the same creative silence we'd first discovered months earlier. Clients started noticing the shift in my work too, something warmer creeping into even my most routine assignments, like happiness had genuinely changed the way I saw the world through my lens. One particular afternoon in early winter, we were both working quietly in that shared studio space, snow falling softly outside the windows, when Renata set down her paintbrush and crossed the room toward me without any explanation. I looked up from my laptop just as she reached me, and she didn't say anything at all, simply cupped my face in both hands and kissed me slowly, deeply, the kind of kiss that had no urgency behind it, because we finally had all the time in the world. I pulled her closer, laughing softly against her mouth, asking what had prompted that in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She just smiled, forehead resting against mine, saying she'd simply felt like it, and that she planned on kissing me exactly like that for the rest of her life if I'd let her. I told her, only half joking, that she could count on it, and something about the easy certainty in my own voice still surprised me sometimes, even months later. This was a version of myself I hadn't known existed before her, someone capable of trusting completely, of building a life instead of simply surviving one. We stood there for a while, wrapped around each other in the middle of that studio, snow drifting silently past the windows, neither of us in any hurry to let go. Eventually she pulled back slightly, though her arms stayed looped loosely around my waist, something more serious settling gradually into her expression. She was quiet for a moment, like she was gathering courage for something she'd clearly been thinking about for a while. And I waited, giving her the space to find the words at her own pace. "I've been thinking about something," she finally said, her voice softer and more vulnerable than her usual confident tone. "Something I want more than almost anything else in my life." I asked her gently what it was, my thumb tracing small circles against her waist, and she looked up at me with an expression that held equal parts hope and fear tangled together. "I want to be a mother," she said quietly, "and I've wanted it for years, long before I ever let myself imagine it might actually happen with someone I love this much." Something warm and overwhelming spread through my chest hearing her say it. The word loved landing somewhere deep and permanent inside me, even though it wasn't the main point of her sentence. I told her, honestly, that I wanted that too, that somewhere over these past months, I'd started imagining a future that included exactly that kind of noise and chaos and love, filling up our shared home. Relief washed visibly across her face, like she'd been bracing herself for a different answer entirely. Like some small, scared part of her still couldn't quite believe good things were allowed to stay. I pulled her back into my arms, promising her quietly that whatever that path looked like, however complicated or difficult it turned out to be, we'd walk it together, one step fully chosen at a time. We talked for hours that evening, curled together on the studio floor the way we had that very first stormy night, mapping out possibilities neither of us had any real answers for yet. There were logistics to consider, decisions about which of us might carry a pregnancy, conversations about doctors and options we knew nothing about yet, but none of it felt frightening the way it might have once. It felt exciting instead. A shared project belonging entirely to us, built on a foundation strong enough to hold whatever came next. I remember looking at her that night, snow still falling steadily outside, and thinking that this, finally, was the life I hadn't let myself believe I deserved. Looking back now, I realize that conversation marked the true beginning of everything that followed. The quiet decision that would eventually lead us somewhere neither of us could have fully imagined that snowy winter evening. We didn't know yet how difficult that particular road would become, how many disappointments waited for us before we reached anything resembling an answer. But sitting there together, wrapped in blankets on our studio floor, none of that uncertainty mattered yet. All that mattered was her voice, steady and hopeful beside me, and the quiet, certain feeling that whatever came next, we would face it exactly the way we'd faced everything else, completely together. 3 years passed between that snowy evening in our studio and the morning I found myself standing ankle-deep in warm, clear water off the coast of the Bahamas, though somehow it felt like both a lifetime and no time at all. The road to get there had been longer and harder than either of us imagined that hopeful winter night, filled with appointments and waiting rooms and disappointments that tested us in ways we hadn't fully prepared for. Renata had gone first, insisting gently but firmly that she wanted to try, that some part of her needed to at least attempt carrying the child we both wanted so badly. 2 years of trying, of hope rising and falling with every appointment, had ended with a doctor's quiet explanation that her body simply wasn't going to make that particular dream possible. I remember holding her the night we got that final answer, both of us crying in a way that felt like grief, even though nothing had technically been lost yet, just a version of the future we'd quietly pictured without ever saying it out loud. She apologized to me over and over that night, like her body's limitations were somehow a personal failure, and I held her face in my hands the way I had that very first afternoon in her studio years earlier. "This isn't your fault," I told her firmly. This changes nothing about how much I love you, or how much we're going to build a family regardless of how it happens." It took her weeks to fully believe that, but eventually the grief softened into something gentler. And one evening she looked at me with quiet, careful hope and asked if I might consider trying myself. I said yes, before she even finished the question. Something settling into place inside me the moment I understood what she was really asking. The process for me went differently than it had for her. Easier in some ways, harder in others. But 6 months later, we sat together in a small clinic room and watched a screen show us the flickering proof that it had finally worked. Renata cried harder in that moment than I'd ever seen her cry before, gripping my hand so tightly it left small marks, both of us laughing and crying at the same time, in a way that felt like every hard year had finally been worth it. We told our closest friends first, then eventually Marcus, who to both our relief responded with genuine, uncomplicated happiness for us both. Now, standing here with the sun warm against my shoulders and my belly rounded with 6 months of the life growing inside me, none of that difficult road feels like anything except the price we paid for exactly this moment. Renata walked beside me along the shoreline, her hand resting protectively against the small of my back, the way it had every single day since we found out. She still carried a quiet ache sometimes. I could see it flicker across her face occasionally, when strangers assumed the baby was simply mine and mine alone. A small grief she'd learned to hold gently instead of letting it consume her. I made sure she knew, every single day, that this baby belonged to both of us equally, regardless of whose body had carried it. We'd chosen the Bahamas for this trip specifically, a celebration before everything changed permanently, before sleepless nights and diapers and the beautiful chaos we both knew was coming soon enough. The water ahead of us looked impossibly clear, that particular shade of turquoise that seemed almost unreal against the white sand beneath it. Renata took my hand and pulled me gently toward the waves, laughing at my exaggerated complaints about how cold the water probably was, though we both knew perfectly well it wouldn't be cold at all. We waded in slowly together, the warm water rising gradually around our ankles, then our knees, salt and sunlight, and her laughter filling up every one of my senses at once. When the water reached our waists, she turned to face me, sunlight scattering across the surface around us in 1,000 small, bright reflections. She rested one hand gently against the curve of my belly, feeling for movement the way she did dozens of times a day now. An expression of pure wonder crossing her face the same way it had every single time since we first felt that flutter. I placed my hand over hers, holding it there against the life we'd built together through every difficult step of this long, uncertain road. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, just standing there in the warm water, feeling the baby shift gently beneath both our palms. She looked up at me then, brown eyes bright with something that looked exactly like the peace I remembered seeing that very first morning after the storm years earlier. "I love you," she said simply, her voice steady and sure in a way that carried the weight of everything we'd survived together to arrive at this particular moment. I told her I loved her too, that I'd love her through every version of our life still waiting ahead of us, whatever shape it eventually took. She smiled at that, the same smile that had first caught my attention across a crowded backyard party 3 years earlier, except now it belonged entirely to me, freely and completely, without a single shadow of guilt or hesitation attached to it. Without any warning, she reached up and pulled me gently by the back of the neck, closing the distance between us, the way she had that unforgettable stormy night in front of the fireplace. Our lips met slowly in the warm water, salt lingering faintly on both our mouths. The same soft, unhurried magic present in that kiss that had always existed between us since the very beginning. I could taste the ocean and her laughter, and 3 years of hard-won happiness all mixed together in that single perfect moment. The water moved gently around us, sunlight dancing across the surface, our baby resting quietly between our joined hands, and every fear I'd once carried about wanting something I had no right to want finally, completely, dissolved into nothing at all. I think back sometimes to that terrified version of myself standing in my closet years ago, picking out an outfit for an anniversary party, having no idea her entire life was about to change direction completely. I think about the guilt, the walls I'd built after loving someone who made me disappear, the quiet conviction that love like this simply wasn't meant for someone like me. If you'd told that woman standing in her apartment that night what waited for her on the other side of all that fear, I don't think she would have believed you. But standing here now, in warm water off the coast of paradise, my wife's lips still soft against mine, and our child resting safely beneath both our hands, I finally understand that some love stories start in the wrong place entirely, forbidden and complicated and messy, before finding their way to exactly where they were always supposed to end up. If this story moved you even half as much as living it moved me, please make sure you're subscribed to RP, Forbidden Romances, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Drop a comment and let me know what part of this journey stayed with you the most. And give this video a like if you believe love, even the complicated kind, always finds its way home eventually. Thank you for staying with me through every part of this story. I'll see you in the next one.